Lots of people have publicly taken political compass tests over the years on YouTube to kind of establish where they stand. While I've taken and published the test, I haven't explained my reasoning through it ever. So, being hard up for content, I thought I might give that a go, give you some insights into what I think on these political issues and why, and also as a kind of rebuttal to people who seem to think that I've moved to the right and somehow maybe I have turned into a fascist without realizing it, but let's find out. So, if economic globalization is inevitable, it should primarily serve humanity rather than the interests of transnational corporations. Well, obviously, to me, it should serve the people, but rather than globalization, I would characterize what I believe in as internationalism, that is slowly removing barriers, equalizing the amount of technology and support and wealth available to people. And globalization done right, internationalism seems to me to be a good way to go about that. It's slowly, transitionally. Globalization as it stands currently seems to be more about exploiting weakness in certain areas of the globe in order to make larger profits elsewhere in the globe, and this seems to be doing a lot of damage. So, as it stands now, which is this corporatist version, I would disagree with it, but as a growing cooperation and equalization internationally, that's something I would agree with. So, I would strongly agree. I'd always support my country whether it was right or wrong. Country is an accident of geography. It is essentially meaningless to me. My attachments to history exist everywhere. You have to learn from the past in order to move forward into the future, but that doesn't mean you should be held accountable for the things from the past. So, national boundaries are arbitrary lines on a map. They're essentially meaningless to me. So I strongly disagree. No one chooses his or her country of birth, so it's foolish to be proud of it. Well, obviously that pretty much follows on from the previous question, so I strongly agree. It's foolish to be proud of that. And the same thing goes for colour and other things like that. Sexuality. All of that. It's moronic to be proud of things you have no control over and no responsibility for. Our race has many superior qualities compared with other races. Now, I just went through all that, so pretty obviously I strongly disagree. Race is essentially meaningless. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, ideologically speaking, no. Pragmatically speaking, yes, to an extent. So, rather than strongly disagree, I'm going to go with disagree, because practical circumstances sometimes demand that you work with people who are your enemies, just not as bad enemies as the other enemies. Military action that defies international law is sometimes justified. Well, I think we can all think of certain situations in which breaking the law is justified, whether it's international law or local law. So, sometimes justified, agree, just not strongly agree. There is now a worrying fusion of information and entertainment. Yes, but the emphasis has tended to be more on the entertainment than the information, and that's where the problem lies in. Yet, at the same time, you want information to be presented in an entertaining way so that people are more likely to pay attention and take it in. I think Professor Brian Cox's work is more to the good side of that, and Bill Nye the Science Guy's recent stuff is more on the wrong side of that. So I'm going to agree, but not strongly. People are ultimately divided more by class than nationality. Well, it's about what I believe, isn't it? I mean, people divide themselves by nation, but people are divided by class. Class and wealth has a far bigger effect on what you can do, your access to education, your access to food, nutrition, housing, you name it. So people choose to divide themselves by nation, but people are divided more by class. So strongly agree. Controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment. I tend to focus on people, so I'm going to say having people employed is more important, but only an agree, not a strongly agree. For societal health as a whole, I think people in work is a good thing. Because corporations cannot be trusted to voluntarily protect the environment, they require regulation. Yes, absolutely. I mean, even with the regulation that we have, we constantly and consistently see companies trying to weasel around it, game the system, mislabel things, sneakily dump toxic waste, all the rest of it. So they absolutely cannot be trusted. Why can't they be trusted? Because the only motive that has any real impact on a company is the profit motive, and it turns companies into psychopaths. So yeah, strongly agree. Unfortunately, it would be nice if people could self-regulate, but they can't. From each according to his ability to each according to his need is a fundamentally good idea. Yes, but not to the extent of homogeneity, which is the extent to which some forms of communism take it. Not everybody should have the same thing, but those who are more able to provide for a reasonable baseline for society should. So, agree. It is a sad reflection on our society that something as basic as drinking water is now a bottled, branded consumer product. Yes and no, there shouldn't be any need, but people should be free to waste their money on such a thing if they want to. But then on the other hand, we have lots of people in areas who are forced to use bottled water to drink. And this is both in capitalist nations, I mean, just look at Flint, Michigan, and in nations that operate under other schemes, such as China. Do not drink the water in China. So agree, but not strongly agree. Land shouldn't be a commodity to be bought and sold. Ideally not, but who do you trust to parcel it out? How do you determine the relative worth of land outside of a system of buying and selling? How much brownfield site is equivalent to how much greenfield site, and so on. So in principle I agree, but pragmatically not. So agree, but not strongly agree. It is regrettable that many personal fortunes are made by people who simply manipulate money and contribute nothing to their society. Absolutely, especially since so much of this money is made really by defrauding people or by taking huge gambling risks with other people's money. And it's a system that rewards people who take those risks, and then that's how things get out of control and you get massive financial crashes. That's also why there's so much sexism in the city. Testosterone and so on makes men take a lot more risks, which means it's high risk, high reward. They also fail more often. If you want a reliable return, find yourself a female broker. Protectionism is sometimes necessary in trade. Preferably not, but again, pragmatically speaking, we can all think of circumstances in which it could be necessary. So, agree, but not strongly. The only social responsibility of a company should be to deliver a profit to its shareholders. Strongly disagree, because this is the problem with companies. This is why they act like psychopaths. This is why they do deeply unethical, nasty, horrible things in the pursuit of profit. However, social responsibility doesn't just mean imposing your own political agenda on the public, as we've seen problems emerging on Facebook, Twitter, Google, Patreon, and so on. The social good is not served by having a particular political agenda either. You know, society as a whole is society as a whole. It's not just people on the left, it's not just people on the right, it's not just authoritarians, it's not just libertarians, it's not just the government, it's not just pressure groups, you know, whatever. The social good in those instances is made up of facilitating communication. So, strongly disagree, but, you know, you need to really think it through when you answer that kind of question. I've hit the 10-minute mark, so let's speed things up a bit from here on out. The rich are too highly taxed. Well, that's very contextual and dependent upon which country you're in. In the UK, I strongly disagree. They are not paying their share or paying their way, particularly when it comes to companies and company owners. So, strongly disagree. Those with the ability to pay should have access to higher standards of medical care. Not really, no. They do, and I don't object too strongly to that, so long as the NHS continues to improve, and I wouldn't want to prevent people who have the opportunity or the means from paying in for more medical care. So I'm rather conflicted here. So I'm going to disagree, but not strongly. Governments should penalise businesses that mislead the public. Strongly agree. Yeah, that's lying, misrepresentation. That could be talking about ingredients. It could be talking about chemicals, behaviour. It could be false advertising. You know, these are all important things. So there needs to be some kind of counterbalance because they can't be trusted to do it themselves. A genuine free market requires restrictions on the ability of predator multinationals to create monopolies. That's a consequence of a genuine free market. So the question kind of contradicts itself, but I agree with restrictions on companies from being able to form massive monopolies and therefore to become, you know, the only power in areas. So I'm going to strongly agree with that, though I think the wording's terrible. The freer the market, the freer the people. Absolutely not, because of the emergence of these kind of monopolies and so on. And when you don't control companies, they just exploit people, fuck them over, become immensely powerful, pervert governance, pervert elections and so on. So strongly disagree. Abortion, when the woman's life is not threatened, should always be illegal. I strongly disagree. Okay, I am pro-abortion. I see absolutely no moral or ethical problem with abortion up until the point that the fetus begins to develop consciousness, which is at some point after the 20th week. I think it's around the 24th week when people say that the brain starts operating in such a way as to indicate the first flickerings of consciousness. That's when a fetus becomes, or starts to become, a person rather than a lump of flesh. And it's at that point that something is actually lost rather than prevented from coming about. So I'm all for abortion up until that point. After that point, I think it starts to get iffy, and that's when you should have a medical or psychological reason for it, you know. And I also advocate for men's right to legal parental surrender to at least somewhat equalise reproductive rights. But as the question's presented, I strongly disagree that abortion should be illegal. All authority should be questioned. Strongly agree. We must always question absolutely everything, particularly authority that has sway over us. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I strongly disagree. That's vengeance, not justice. And experiments in game theory demonstrate that being forgiving up to a point is the more winning strategy. So we should always give people a chance to repent and reform. Taxpayers should not be expected to prop up any theatres or museums that cannot survive on a commercial basis. I believe art has intrinsic value beyond money, so I agree up to a point, but will stop short of strongly agreeing because they need to be at least somewhat viable, and often on a sort of class basis, a lot of money goes into things like opera houses and so on. That's not really justified. You know, the only people appreciating and using it are the 1%. And while we should preserve the arts and the buildings, there's always a certain amount of triage when it comes to public funds. You need to spend it in the right way. So while I would not choke off art funding, I think you always need to consider and think. And in other instances, things like NASA, I'm strongly against taking money away from NASA for other things because it's an investment in the future, whereas these things are an investment in the past. Schools should not make classroom attendance compulsory. I strongly disagree. Education is about the most important thing. Obviously there's provisos, education can be used to indoctrinate and so on. So it depends under what system you find yourself, but in general I would strongly disagree there. All people have their rights, but it's better for all of us that different sorts of people should keep to their own kind. Strongly disagree. We all benefit from mixing. Now I know people react badly to the whole idea of diversity is our strength, but it's true when it comes to viewpoints. And many of the most successful and powerful societies in history have been melting pots where different cultures come together. But that doesn't mean you should be okay with absolutely anything. Even the Islamic Golden Age took place at a time where Islam was much more multicultural and accepting, and it stopped being the Golden Age when they stopped doing that. So people should mix. But that doesn't mean you should accept absolutely anything. Good parents sometimes have to spank their children. There are extreme circumstances in which it's okay, but most of the time I would say no, never, but pragmatism again, so I'm going to disagree but not strongly. It's natural for children to keep some secrets from their parents. Absolutely, strongly agree. It's part of the growing process, and individuating and becoming yourself is to have your own life, so of course. Possessing marijuana for personal use should not be a criminal offence. Strongly agree. It doesn't hurt anybody. It should all be legal. I'd legalise most drugs, and I would use the funds raised by that for things like recovery programs and so on like that. I regard narcotics abuse as a health issue, and I don't regard marijuana use as narcotics abuse any more than beer is. The prime function of schooling should be to equip the future generation to find jobs. Technology and so on moves too quickly for that to be practical anymore. I think the function of schooling should be to provide you with basic important knowledge to help you find out what it is that you like, that you're good at, that you're interested in, so you can pursue it. But most importantly, it shouldn't tell you what to think. It should help you learn how to think. We should be teaching people critical thinking skills and how their society works and so on. So, but at the same time, you do want people to have practical skills. So I'm going to disagree, but not strongly disagree. People with serious inheritable disabilities should not be allowed to reproduce. People with heritable disabilities shouldn't reproduce, but it should be off their own backs, really. It's cruel to kids. We've seen instances where people are selecting fetuses that have the trait that makes them deaf and so on because their parents are deaf. This is just kind of cruel, nasty activism, But obviously, the other side of that is eugenics. So the crux of it is to be allowed to. I think we should encourage people not to reproduce if they have serious heritable disabilities. So I'm going to agree but not strongly agree, because I agree that we shouldn't reproduce if we have those issues, but the allowed part introduces caution. The most important thing for children to learn is to accept discipline. Strongly disagree. That's authoritarianism again. There are no savage and civilized peoples, there are only different cultures. There are only different cultures. Some are better, some are worse, not all are equal. The Aztecs cut out people's hearts and threw them into water, which helped them all die of disease, or a lot of them die of disease, apparently. And they were engaged in human sacrifice. That is a savage culture. They were civilized in other ways, uncivilized in that. When the British went to India, they killed off the Thuggy cult and ended the practice of sooty, where the widows would be burned on pyres with their dead husbands. India was civilized, but it had uncivilized and savage elements. So certain forms of society are better for human flourishing and for understanding reality and so on than others. I'm going to disagree, but not strongly, because the implication there is racial superiority, which I don't agree with. Those who are able to work and refuse the opportunity should not expect society's support. I think everyone should get a base level regardless. I support basic income, and then it's down to the individual whether they choose to work and improve their circumstances or not, so long as everyone is provided for at least the basic level. You shouldn't be forced to do things you hate just to get by. We have an issue here in the UK where people who've been on job seekers allowance and so on for a long time are made to work essentially as slave labour for large supermarkets like Tesco, and that is a moral and ethical outrage. So I'm going to disagree, but not strongly disagree. When you're troubled, it's better not to think about it, but to keep busy with more cheerful things. I have no real opinion on that. I don't see how it's political. I suffer from depression, but I think it's better to try and tackle that than to ignore it. So I'm going to disagree, but not strongly. First generation immigrants can never be fully integrated within their new country. We've had various waves of immigration in this country, and many of the problems that we're having now are not with first generation immigrants, but with second or third generation immigrants looking for an identity that they feel that they don't have. And those first generation immigrants are often ones who really wanted to be here, wanted to settle here, admired the culture and so on, and made great pains and efforts to integrate for the large part. So I'm going to strongly disagree there. What's good for the most successful corporations is always ultimately good for all of us. Again, corporations are psychopaths because all they care about is money. As a collective aggregate entity, and what's good for profit is not necessarily good for people. So strongly disagree. No broadcasting institution, however independent its content, should receive public funding. Commercial pressure can distort and pervert things like news reporting and so on. We've seen this with clickbait, we've seen this with cable news, with talk radio and so on. We see this pressure from sponsors, pressures from companies, and where public broadcasters are directly funded by the government, we see the same issue there. But that doesn't mean that public funding is necessarily wrong. The way the BBC goes about it, even though it's been eroded over time, was always better. It received public funds, but the government had no real direct say over what it did. It was an independent entity. So I'm going to strongly disagree. Public funding is a way, if it's done right, of releasing a broadcasting institution from undue influence from elsewhere. Our civil liberties are being excessively curbed in the name of counter-terrorism. Absolutely, strongly agree. We have done far more harm to ourselves than any number of terrorist bombs ever could. The thing that makes us better in our society than the kind of society that they want to inflict is that we're freer. But how long that's going to continue, I don't know, because our civil liberties are now being excessively curbed in the name of preventing offence and political correctness and so on. So those are also excessively curbing our civil liberties. So, yes. A significant advantage of a one-party state is that it avoids all the arguments that delay progress in a democratic political system. Hypothetically, you could have a benevolent dictator of some sort, but it has never ever seemed to have happened in history. Certainly not without some kind of moderation by some parliament or elected body or something in control of it, or moderating it rather. So strongly disagree. I mean, I can see how hypothetically it could happen, but I don't see how it actually could happen. Although the electronic age makes official surveillance easier, only wrongdoers need to be worried. Strongly disagree. As we're seeing, even private entities like Google are monitoring people and have a very distinct and strong political bias, which they are imposing on people that work for them, and increasingly upon people that use their products. So, no, everyone should be worried, because you never know who is going to be a wrongdoer next. The death penalty should be an option for the most serious crimes. Strongly disagree. You murdered someone. Murdering people is wrong and bad, so we're going to murder you. I mean, the issues are obvious, not to mention the problem that these people are often innocent. DNA evidence has exonerated so many people, many of them on death row, since the advent of DNA evidence, and has shown that other people from the past could be innocent. You know, you have to be absolutely sure before you execute someone. I think the only circumstance in which that might be okay is if they confess to the crime, are convicted of the crime, and volunteer for the death penalty. In that instance, perhaps, but that's more like voluntary euthanasia, so strongly disagree. In a civilized society, one must always have people above to be obeyed and people below to be commanded. Strongly disagree. It's much better when we all cooperate, compromise and so on with each other. Authority has issues. Abstract art that doesn't represent anything shouldn't be considered art at all. There's not a lot of abstract art I like, but there's some of it that I do, but my personal taste has nothing to do with it at all. And I think commercial art is art. So, strongly disagree. In criminal justice, punishment should be more important than rehabilitation. Strongly disagree, and we have so many studies on this that show that rehabilitation is the way to go. I mean, ideally we want people to come out of prison and be productive members of society. We don't want them to go back to it, you know? So we should bend every effort to retraining, reforming and rehabilitation. It's a waste of time to try to rehabilitate some criminals. There are people who are irredeemable, but that's usually due to mental health issues, which makes them a health problem, not a prison system problem, not a correctional problem. So disagree, but not strongly disagree, because it does occur, and don't agree with the categorization, and that's me being picky. The business person and the manufacturer are more important than the writer and the artist. I strongly disagree. I think culture is very important. These things don't exist without each other, but I don't think either is necessarily more important than the other. You know, okay, so manufacturing and so on meets our life needs, you know, our immediate survival needs more, but a life without anything more isn't much for life at all. Mothers may have careers, but their first duty is to be homemakers. That could be the man or the woman, so strongly disagree. I think men and women get fulfillment from certain, you know, kind of traditional roles. I don't see a problem with people fitting into traditional roles, so long as it's voluntary. And if you want to buck the traditional role, you want the man to be the homemaker, you should be able to as well, without judgment. So I think traditionalists should be able to be traditionalists without being judged, and everyone else exactly the same way. Multinational companies are unethically exploiting the plant genetic resources of developing countries. Yes. Yeah, I agree. They are. Not all of them, but enough of them for it to be a problem. And these are things that should be paying off for those countries that have these resources, because they're often poor. Not that countries mean much to me, but, you know, pragmatically, yeah. Making peace with the establishment is an important aspect of maturity. I strongly disagree. There's no reason why being mature should stop you being a firebrand and a rebel. It just means you got more experience at it. Astrology accurately explains many things. It's absolute bollocks. I strongly disagree. You cannot be moral without being religious. Strongly disagree. Religions are just off-the-peg moralities, and often fundamentally and thoroughly immoral, and even by their own standards. So strongly disagree. Charity is better than social security as a means for helping the genuinely disadvantaged. Strongly disagree. Charities are even less efficient than centralized bureaucracy in moving money around and getting people helped. They don't necessarily have access to the same kind of data that the government has, and we have tried relying on philanthropy in the Victorian era, so go and read your Dickens. It doesn't work. Some people are naturally unlucky. Nobody is lucky or unlucky, it's probabilities, it's circumstance. Luck isn't really a thing, it's just a term we use to explain these kind of things, so strongly disagree. It is important that my child's school instills religious values. The opposite. It is important that my child's school does not instill religious values, and rather encourages genuine thought, thinking, and understanding the circumstances of things, science, reason, logic, critical thinking. These are things I want taught in schools, not religion at all. Okay, next page. Sex outside marriage is usually immoral. Strongly disagree. This is obviously some strange new spelling of the word fantastic that I was previously unaware of. Sex is sex, it's fun, it doesn't have to have consequences anymore. You don't knock yourself out as long as you're careful. A same-sex couple in a stable, loving relationship should not be excluded from the possibility of child adoption. Strongly agree. If they can provide a loving home for a kid, that's got to be good. Even if you think that's not as good as an opposite-sex couple providing a home for a child, it's got to be better than not having a home. So, yeah, even from a bigot's position, it doesn't make any sense. So, yes, they should be able to adopt. Pornography depicting consenting adults should be legal for the adult population. Strongly agree. It's nobody else's business so long as everybody involved in the production is consenting, so long as everyone watching the production is consenting. As long as nobody gets hurt, and even then, so long as people volunteer to get hurt and it's not life-threatening or whatever, who the fuck cares? What goes on in a private bedroom between consenting adults is no business of the state. Strongly agree, and it's also nobody else's business either. No one can feel naturally homosexual. I have no idea, so I'm going to have to go on the word of my homosexual friends and say that they are naturally homosexual. So, strongly disagree. These days, openness about sex has gone too far. No, I think an openness about sex is healthy, so strongly disagree. So, where am I then? I am way down in the bottom left, just as I've always been. I have perhaps moved one square closer to the center, and if I have, I would say that's a consequence of encountering lunatics who take ideas that I otherwise agree with too far, and my pragmatism becoming stronger. So, there you go. Still not a Nazi. Still the opposite of a Nazi, but slightly more centrist than I used to be. Zang.